Welcome to today's GC Advantage webinar, From Startup Through IPO, the General Counsel's Journey of Transformation. My name is Bob Barker, and thanks for joining today. A quick overview on our firm. So we help clients build, develop, and optimize their legal and compliance departments. We recruit general counsel, any lawyer reporting into the general counsel, as well as chief compliance officers. We also provide coaching, mentoring, and advising to help accelerate your success. As far as the program, this GC Advantage program, it's our professional development program for corporate legal and compliance leaders. It provides an opportunity to interact and learn from other GCs, CCOs, CEOs, and board members, as well as executive search consultants, to help gain some insights, again, to advance your career. Today's presentation is being recorded, and an email will be sent to everyone who registered once the material is available. We also have all of our GC Advantage webinars are available on demand. Includes a video recording, podcast, any slides that may have been used during the event. As far as some upcoming webinars, next Thursday, we have Navigating the Nuances of General Counsel Compensation. It looks at the most critical attributes of today's general counsel, how compensation plays into play during the GC recruiting process, and also finding from Equilar's General Counsel Pay Trends Report, which is all of the Fortune 500 compensation for general counsel compensation. And then October 11th, the next event is the recipe for making a general counsel, and it's practical, actionable steps and critical information for aspiring general counsel. And so you'll get an opportunity to learn from some successful general counsel, board members, and an executive search consultant, what they did, what they counsel, and what they look for in candidates to fill GC roles. As far as during the webinar today, please submit your questions. You can just click on the Q&A icon in the Zoom application. You'll also be able to see other questions that have been submitted. And if you have a question that's already listed, you can just click the thumbs up icon, and that way the panelists will know it's a popular question. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible by the end of this presentation. At this point, I'll turn it over to Jennifer, and I'll be back at the end of today's program.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Pileggi, and I was a longtime public company general counsel. In mid-2015, I switched things up a little bit and joined a later stage private enterprise software company called Zuora as its first general counsel. I built the legal department there as the company grew and matured, and helped take the company public in mid-2018. I then continued to run the legal and compliance functions and took on some other responsibilities as well, until I decided to move away from GC roles early last year, and I joined BarkerGilmore as a senior advisor and coach. We have a great program today, as Bob noted. As a company moves through its life cycle from a startup to a more mature private company, to getting ready for its IPO, to being a more established public company, the role of the general counsel necessarily needs to change as well. And that runs from building and managing and setting expectations for your team, to managing your evolving relationships with your management team and board, even to focusing on your own development as a general counsel, moving from a more transactional and function-specific role to a strategic advisor. We have an incredible panel put together for today's program. All of these people are former general counsel who joined private companies at some point during each company's maturity and took those companies public. They have a wealth of really valuable information to share for us today about their experiences. So with that, I will turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Lora Blum.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Lora Blum. I am formerly the Chief Legal Officer of Momentive, which many of you may also know as SurveyMonkey. We went through a name change and actually changed the name back to SurveyMonkey in August, right before I left. Very confusing. I was there for a little over 6.5 years from beginning of 2017 until just this past September 1st. We went public in 2018. Before that, I was at LinkedIn leading the corporate legal function for about 6.5 years. And before that, I was in private practice for a little over 10 years at a few different law firms. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Laura. Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And it's a pleasure to be here. My most recent role was with Anaplan. I was there for 9 years as head of legal general counsel. And that was a great experience. Saw them through, early funding stages, IPO, and then a private equity buyout. And before that, I was fortunate to be part of some really great legal environments, everything from Adobe to MySQL, Sun, Oracle. I started my career at Federal Reserve Bank, which is a whole other story. It's just a different type of entity, which was a great experience. But overall, I'm really pleased to be able to be here and share some of my experience.
Terrific. Thank you. And Sharon Zezima?
Yeah, hi. Yes, thank you for including me in this panel of amazing speakers. I've been general counsel at a variety of tech companies, including Marketo and GoPro, which I both took public, and part of why I'm on this panel, as well as a couple of other companies that were private. And I started out as deputy GC at Electronic Arts prior to going to the company that I first took public. And recently, I've actually transitioned out of full-time GC work to do mission-based, policy-oriented projects for companies like the Aspen Institute and Policy Lake.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to today's program. Let's dive in by actually putting it back on you and asking if you could each provide a brief overview of your path to the general counsel seat. I'll start again with Laura.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I started in private practice for a little over 10 years. My first in-house role was at LinkedIn, and I was the fourth lawyer on that team. Joined about a little over a year before we went public. Joined in June of 2010. We were public. I guess a little under a year. We were public May of 2011, and did everything from the capital markets work. We bought about 25 different companies while I was there. We sold to Microsoft right before I left. That was part of the reasoning behind my thinking of leaving was that my role would have changed had I stayed. I received a call from a friend who was friends with the CEO at SurveyMonkey. And it just so happened that they were looking for a new general counsel. This was while we were in the midst of selling LinkedIn to Microsoft. And I thought, well, it can't hurt to talk to him and meet him. Turns out we actually had worked together before. So when he was a banker and I was a private practice securities lawyer at Wilson Sonsini. And so we talked, got along really well. He asked me to meet a few other folks. Then asked me to meet some of his board members, at which point I figured I was actually interviewing for the role. And one of the reasons he was very interested in talking to me was actually my IPO experience, because he had been fairly open about the fact that SurveyMonkey was interested in a path to liquidity, and particularly through the public markets. And so because I had been at LinkedIn and helped through the IPO process there, and because of my background in capital markets and securities, that I think really helped generate the interest in me to become the general counsel. So that was a very specific need that the company had, and I had a particular set of skills that they were interested in, and so that was my path, and it worked out really well. I loved it there.
Terrific. Yeah, you were there for a long time. I will switch to Sharon.
Yeah, so I started out in law firms as an employment lawyer, not corporate, not securities. But I will tell you, employment law has served me very well as a GC over the years. From private practice, I went to EA. I was there for almost 12 years. I started out as an employment lawyer, also doing some transactional work. And over that time, collected new experiences that turned out to be just interesting in themselves, but also really positioned me well to take on a GC role. EA was a large company with a big name, so I think that helped too. But I did things like I became secretary of the compensation committee because my employment background actually helped there. I did the proxy for a couple of years. I did a lot of international work. I became a chief counsel for one of the divisions. All of this gave me the skills to be a general counsel, but maybe more importantly, it also gave me the ability to convince other people that I could be general counsel because I had done a lot of the things that they would expect general counsels had already done. And that led to my role in my first IPO at Marketo, which is a SaaS marketing tech company. And then, that led to GoPro and that IPO and, other aspects of my career.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm thrilled to have you here as well. And Gary?
Yeah, I've always been in-house, which I think a lot of people are maybe a little envious of. I'm not sure. But
I would say yes.
Yeah.
From my perspective.
But I think, I was fortunate to start at the Federal Reserve Bank, get some really rigorous training in a very structured environment. And after that, I really focused on things like commercial transactions and product-oriented legal work. And that was with the tech companies that I started out with, places like Adobe. But the first taste of the more leadership side of legal, I think, was at MySQL, because they were a pre-IPO company and they were a pretty hot commodity at the time, so hot that Sun Microsystems decided to buy them. And so that left me as the last person standing in the legal department supporting that leftover business unit. And that I'll call that my GC light experience, where I was the person people came to for any question that related to that product line. So I had to think on the fly and work directly with the executives who were looking for answers. But there was always the support team at these larger companies because Oracle then purchased Sun. So I didn't have the full view. And I just happened to meet at my next job at LiveOps, I happened to meet a VP of finance there who became the first CFO of Anaplan. And this is when they were very small. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but when I was looking for a new role, several months later, I just happened to call him, and he was, as CFO, he's doing a lot of the legal work or coordinating legal things. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come in? I could use some help." So my role was very, sales oriented when I first joined. And from there, people would ping me with different questions on different subject matter, the head of HR, the CRO, CFO. And eventually I just had to develop this tool set of skills. And that broadened my perspective and also made me think more like an executive, how to get this done from a strategic perspective. So that was really, I'll call my real GC experience at Anaplan, where learn on the fly and really get embedded with the culture and get embedded with the business. That really helped me kind of see my way through.
And then when you were ready to go public, you already had that business experience and were known as a business partner. And I had a similar experience when I left private practice. I went to be the first attorney at a small company that was part of a much larger public company. And I had to wear all hats. I had to learn employment law. I had to learn real estate law. I had to do all the contracts and set up the whole legal department and hire eventually underneath me. And when the public parent company GC retired, after I'd been in that business unit head of legal role for maybe 7 years, I was tapped for the public GC role because I was known as a strong business partner and knew the business and the culture so well, not because I had any corporate or securities experience. And I had to kind of learn that on the fly. And that was kind of my path to it as well. Let's move to the next slide. So how was the legal function and the GC role in particular viewed at your company when you joined? And then did that change as your company matured? I'll ask Gary to field that one to start.
Sure. Now, absolutely. When I started my role, I think people viewed it as, let's get more sales deals in the, over the finish line, and the legal team can really help us do that.
Right.
So that was my role. I think that was my perceived role, and I was happy to do it because I really was excited about the culture. But
Yeah.
over time, I mentioned other people in the company would ask questions, and they weren't necessarily subject matter areas I knew about. I had to go learn about it. And then there became a lot of gaps in the organization where legal work was clearly needed just to keep us moving in the strategic direction we wanted. And as I built out a team, it was really helpful to, be able to fill those gaps. And then over time, as you get closer to the IPO, there's some very specific needs, and I had to think more strategically there. And that's where there's other executives that can have, based off of their own experiences or their own needs, you get a little more direction about where legal can play a more direct role, whether it's the CFO really needs a specific type of experience for IPO reporting, or those types of things become much more important. And I think legal teams and GCs are well equipped to adapt to what the company needs as it matures, particularly if you do have that business knowledge growing up through the company. That's what really helped me address those needs.
It makes sense. Lora, how did SurveyMonkey at the time, then Momentive, kind of view legal when you joined? And it had been around for a while at that point. Did it have a more narrow focus? Did you take on other hats as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Gary described it well. A very similar experience in terms of the view of legal, and it depends on the department too. But your sales team will think, well, all you guys do is help us negotiate contracts. So what else? There isn't anything else legal needs to do, right? And interestingly, when I joined in the beginning of 2017, one of the areas we were focusing on was privacy because of the nature of our business and because GDPR was coming into effect in mid 2018, and this was before we went public. That was also an area that started to get a lot more attention, mostly because we drew it upon ourselves. And it was hard because people did not understand the importance of compliance, the importance of what was about to happen. And so we really found ourselves having to educate the company and kind of go on a sort of a roadshow in and of itself for privacy before we had the roadshow for the IPO, to try to explain to folks what we were doing and why we were doing it. And so that was one of the sort of many ways we expanded. But I do think that as we grew and as the company grew and as the legal team also grew, not quite as quickly or as large, but especially as we approached the IPO, a lot of folks in the company did begin to understand that there were many other pieces that we, supported the company on. And of course, there are parts of the company that understand that from the beginning. But I do think that the IPO was it's a nice publicity opportunity in some ways for your legal team, because it's something that the entire company is impacted by. So it gives you the opportunity to help educate and be a little bit more on the front lines, where in a lot of other cases you're not. And so I think that helped us, post being public, being recognized as true business partners and folks that could do more than just negotiate a contract, whenever that was necessary, which of course we continue to do.
Right. They get a view of the various hats that you wear and how you are very involved in the business as an executive and as a partner versus just a lawyer negotiating contracts. Sharon, what about you?
Yeah, so I would say my Marketo experience very much what was already discussed. It was a SaaS platform, and sales was very important. And that was definitely, I was the first lawyer in, and that was definitely one of the areas of emphasis. GoPro was interesting because the CEO did not have a corporate experience. He created this product and on a surfing trip, and it's a consumer electronic, and he's very product and marketing focused. And I think his view of lawyers were you're sort of a necessary evil, I think. But he knew, they were looking at an IPO, and he knew he needed a lawyer. But it was almost $1 billion company when I got there, and I was the first lawyer in. So that shows how important they necessarily considered lawyers. They had a large group of outside counsel lawyers working on retainer. But I remember when I had my first headcount when I hired somebody, and the CEO made some comment like, "Oh, you have a minion." And I was sort of surprised by that because I thought, well, this is almost $1 billion company, a consumer electronic IP-oriented company. Like, of course, we're going to have a team. Like, what were you thinking? And it just made me realize kind of the education I needed to give the CEO and sort of what the legal department was and what I could add to that. Over time, I will say he pointed to the legal department as one of the highest performing functions in the company, and he was tremendously supportive of it. But that took time to educate and sort of show results and show value and all of that. But it definitely yielded good results, and I became a more of a business partner over time, for sure.
So he saw it as more than just someone who negotiates a contract when needed.
Oh,
or
absolutely.
handles a patent or something.
Yeah. I mean, no, there were so many things. I mean, the CEO thought IP and patents were really important. So actually taking that in-house and growing a program that was really successful was something he was tremendously proud of, as was I. The point was I had to put in some work to
absolutely
educate him about what a legal department is and how it matures over time and how it supports the company. And he bought into it, not immediately, but he absolutely did. And as I say, became a huge supporter for the legal team.
That's wonderful. That's terrific.
And Jennifer, just on that point, it reminded me of a story that I've experienced many times, particularly at Anaplan. I remember coming in and, this was a Series C startup, and the employees, these are 20-something startup employees who may not have worked at a large company, and they're saying, what exactly does legal do? And I think about how many times I've answered that question in different circumstances. When we got a new CEO, when we got a new CFO, when we had a PE buyer, answering that question evolved so much depending on who's asking and what stage of the company and what stage of my own development.
Yeah, I had a stock presentation that I tweaked over the years, depending on who I was talking about it with, but it's pretty much just the legal department and what we do. And it showed all these different hats and all these different things that we had a hand in. And again, I showed it to people right out of college. I showed it to the board. I showed it to the management team. And just over the years, I had to use it a lot. So I get that. Let's move to the next slide. So how did all of your roles change specifically from the earlier days? We touched on it a little bit in the last question, but did where you spent the bulk of your time change as the company matured? Lora?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the way my role changed was more of more helping the company from a cultural perspective understand what it meant to be, and very specifically from private to public. That was something that I think I really was able to help with, because I was the only person on the management team that had IPO experience. But we've had have a wonderful management. There is still a wonderful management team at SurveyMonkey, but nobody had been through the IPO process on the senior management team. And so helping not just with the technical stuff, which obviously everybody had to pitch in and do what was necessary, but really understanding what that meant, even small things or not so small things, but how transparent could you be about metrics that you report on? How do you think about how often you talk about certain developments and results, and just getting into that cadence, which everybody understands as a public company. You need to be careful and you need to think about the regulations, but how can you maintain your culture of transparency if that's what your culture is, and still live within kind of the rules that you're going to have to be dealing with. And so really talking about what was important with the other members of the management team, how we wanted to, again, sort of educate the company on why we needed to maybe tweak some things, and how other things were going to remain the same, or they might remain the same, but you just might hear about them a little bit later than you were used to hearing about them.
And how do you balance those risks? You can't just take a very doctrinaire approach about it.
Yeah. So I think my role really transitioned to broadening and helping think about things beyond obviously the legal, but how does that fit in more broadly with what we're trying to do, as a company, both on the business side and the cultural side.
Okay, makes sense. Gary, what about you?
Well, I feel like my initial role at Anaplan, being a earlier stage company, it was really relationship based. And I mean that broadly in the sense that you knew everyone. The company was small enough. We all knew each other personally. And so it was no problem to call someone up. That I would get calls from anybody, from any department. Hey, Gary, what do you think about this from a legal perspective, or just an opinion? And over time, as the company got bigger, my team got bigger, other teams got bigger, the business became more complex. There's this idea that these individuals who are sitting in the management positions, they no longer have direct insight into everything that's going on. So some of what you're doing there is they really just need some good advice in general. It's not even necessarily legal advice. And so I think that was a big transformation for me, was realizing I'm not just supporting these people from a legal perspective, but I'm actually helping them feel good about the decisions they're making, that they're aligned with the strategic objectives of the company. So it's almost like a personal counselor in some ways. And that could be anything from their own personal, stock questions, all the way to a strategic objective in the company. And as GC, it's one thing to give the salesperson an opinion on a contract, but it's quite another to tell the CEO your honest opinion, and where would you make your decision if you were in charge? That's a whole different way of looking at things.
Right. It's not purely legal at all. And I think that at a more mature company, that's what the general counsel has to be. Makes sense. Sharon, what about you?
Yeah, I think both companies that I took public, I was the first attorney first hire in the legal department, and then grew the team. So, you go from kind of putting out fires, doing transactional oriented things, to being a manager and functional leader, to being a leader of the company and a strategic business executive who helps run the company. And not just the legal department. And that's kind of the transformation from, fully mature to where you're starting out. And, there are, I think, benefits to being a GC, probably similar to being an HR and a CFO, is that you support all the groups within the company. So you get a really good holistic view of the company and what's going on. And often you have access to things that maybe other people don't. Because of that, you might see how certain groups could work better together or differently, or help, manage conflict. And being able to use that, I think, is a value that you can add to the company. That's not, strictly a GC job.
It makes the role a lot more fun also, frankly. At least for me, it did.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, that last, I said being a strategic business leader, and you have that on the slide. I often say I wish there were classes for how to be strategic, because I don't think you learn that in law school, and you don't necessarily learn that as a more junior in-house counsel, unless you have a GC who's helping you get to that place and knows how to do it themselves. But being strategic isn't just, it doesn't just come to you. Like, what does that mean? And what does that mean for a GC? And how can a GC be strategic? So, BarkerGilmore, for instance, it would be great to have classes for GCs on how do you increase your sort of strategic value. But I learned on the job.
I think a lot of us we all have to.
Yes.
The more you deal with sort of things that aren't strictly in your swim lane, the more you just get that muscle developed.
Absolutely. And here's a example of something that wasn't in my swim lane, or sort of was, and then a lot of it wasn't. But when we were going public at GoPro, and this became public, so I'm not saying anything out of school, the CEO, just after the IPO, but still within the lockup period, the CEO wanted to give a very large amount of shares to a family foundation that he had just created. So he wanted to get an exception to the lockup so that he could give those. But he wanted to do it. He didn't want the foundation to be locked up either. He didn't want to pass on that obligation, and there were various reasons for that. So he told me, he told the CFO, he told the investment bank, and the investment bank thought it was a great idea and was fully supportive. And they were friends in addition to being their investment bank. And maybe that colored their, maybe not, I don't know. But, I felt like there was something, this could come back to bite us, but I wasn't really sure how, but it felt like something that could. But when I talked to our outside counsel, they said there's no legal issues with it. And I had talked to the CFO, and he said, if the investment bank is okay with it, then we should be okay with it. Anyway, he went ahead and did it, and it really blew up. It blew up with investors and with the investor press. And he got really demoralized because he thought he was doing this good thing, creating this family foundation, funding it, and it ended up being, a really negative thing, at least for a period of time. And I did talk to the CFO after, should we have, or should I have done something more, because it wasn't a legal issue. And I think in retrospect, I don't know that there was anything more. I think the investment bank signed off, the CFO signed off. My spidey sense wasn't a legal spidey sense. It was more, something else. But the point is that you're in the room and you use that influence. If you feel like you have something to say outside of your swim lane, then say it, and hopefully you have a supportive executive team that allows you to do that.
Right. And again, the more I think that those sorts of situations come up, the more you get comfortable with it. We got a question that we can talk about here, and we can talk about it at the end as well. How does a GC learn to be more strategic? And there is no handbook. I don't, unless someone knows something I don't know, there are no resources. It is really just kind of putting yourself out there. This kind of goes into my next question. How do you learn to deal with some of these ambiguities? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I will say, because I said, I call out to BarkerGilmore. I actually do think you could have classes on this. On the job is the most important thing, but giving people some foundation, like you have, finance for lawyers or whatever.
Yeah.
So I do think there is an opportunity out there to do some education.
So look for an upcoming webinar on this. We'll put it together. But given that we don't have that yet, how have you guys learned to deal with some of these ambiguities or unexpected events that come up naturally, particularly during an IPO process, but generally as you're making this kind of transformation to being, more strategic, more of just an overall executive helping to run a company and bringing your legal skills to bear? How have you learned to deal with it? Gary, thoughts on this?
Well, for me, I think, when I started out as a lawyer, the question was always, what's the answer to this? I was trying to answer a question that was posed to me, and the goal was to get the right answer. And I think a lot of lawyers, that's kind of how your brain is trained to think, is like, what's the answer to this question? But I think as you evolve and become more aware of your client and what the needs are, I think you really do need to focus more on, how do I utilize all the things around me? And one of the big learning experiences I had was working closely with our CEO at Anaplan, because I was fortunate he trusted me enough that he would talk about some of the gives and takes he was going through in his mind on these very sensitive issues, whether it had to do with impact to employees or public perception of the company or public perception of him in some cases. Those are all things that there is no right answer. And I think I felt like I became an executive or a strategic advisor, not because I intentionally thought about it, but because I let go of worrying about ambiguity. There's always going to be ambiguity, and you just have to use the tools, whether it's the cultural strength of the company, the your financial position in the company, the reputation of the company. All those things play into areas where you can leverage for strength.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Thank you. Sharon, thoughts on this one? I know you talked a lot about it already. Any other ways that you kind of learn to deal with unexpected events or other ambiguities?
Yeah. Well, I used to do this presentation on the risk management and high growth entrepreneurial companies. And one of the things I said is you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think, GCs don't deal with the easy questions. Well, if you're the first attorney and maybe you're dealing with all the questions, but as time goes on, you're actually dealing with just the hard ones. Right. And you have to be comfortable making calls in those gray areas. But also with, particularly in my experience, when I went to GoPro from Marketo, I had interviewed with one of the people I interviewed with was a CFO. And then by the time I started, he was in the hospital for an illness and then later died, sadly. So we were without a CFO as we were prepping for an IPO and heading into the org meeting. So I kind of became the point person for the company. Usually it's the CFO and the GC, or maybe the CFO as a lead and the GC as support, but I became the person. I was the only one in the company who had ever been through an IPO and knew anything about it. And I kind of had to step up.
Right.
And in some ways that helped me because that gave me, more credibility as kind of the person in the know. But it was, it was a challenge that I hadn't expected. And then ultimately we did bring in a CFO who had been through IPO as well, and we were good
Right.
partners. But those are kinds of things that happen that you just have to be, prepared for,
Right.
and and hope that the experience you've had before and your good judgment will lead to
Yeah.
good results.
Exactly. Laura, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything that's been said, particularly the getting out of your swim lane and being comfortable with that is, or comfortable with discomfort. I think those
I
are
think
such
that's it.
great, yeah, such great pieces of advice for being strategic. I had
Yeah.
a similar experience, Sharon, kind of opposite timing. Unfortunately, not a death, but at SurveyMonkey, we went public, and our CFO decided we went through one earnings cycle, and then right before the second earnings cycle, which was the year end cycle for it was early 2019, or yeah, early 2019 for the year end 2018, he decided he wanted to retire, which was a bit of a shock, and not anything that any of us were expecting. So all of a sudden we didn't have a CFO. We had an interim CFO and our CEO, and we had me, and we had a CAO. But it was, yeah, I think those kinds of unexpected events, while somewhat scary, at least for me, when they happen sometimes, if you dive in and kind of get what you can out of them, that can really, really help build
Yeah.
your that ability to kind of think on your feet,
Yeah.
in areas that aren't ones that you're used to. So if you're willing to do that, I think that's a great way to build that strategic muscle. Just being
Yeah.
willing to dive in.
And over time, I found that I got less daunted by things that were completely new to me. I figured, all right, we'll figure it out. We're all smart
Completely
people.
agree
We
with
know the
that.
company very well. It's
Yep.
it's new, it's completely unexpected, it's random, but we have I have the ability to figure it out. And that was helpful as part of the evolution for me. Did this evolution in your respective roles at the company as they matured have an effect on your relationship with your boards? And if so, how did that play out? Laura?
Yeah, I would say the relationship I had with the board was pretty strong to begin with. I think we had an excellent board at SurveyMonkey, and one of the things that they did recognize, kind of as we were going through the IPO process, for example, was kind of what each of the management team could bring and where support was needed. And I think they were grateful to some of the for some of the information and the insights that I could bring, just having been through the process. Because even though we had this incredible board, not everyone there had been through an IPO, or had been a while since they had gone through it. And so I think it did help my relationship, because during that process, during any kind of big transaction, you spend so much more time with your board, and
Right.
so that helps. Assuming the relationships are good and that they are willing to build them, I think that is a positive. And you still want to make sure. I think my experience with boards, and I've only been in-house at two companies, but my experience also as outside counsel attending a lot of board meetings, is boards don't want to spend a ton of time on legal issues. And so I think one of the
Absolutely.
things that helped my relationship with the board was, keeping things as brief as we could, but definitely digging in on the issues that were really, really important.
Yeah.
And because I was brief in a lot of stuff, they knew that when I was digging in, it was important. And
Yep.
so that really helped my relationship, which then was very, very important over the last couple of years when we went through a sale
That
process,
makes
which
sense. That makes sense.
Gary understands as well.
Yeah. Gary, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, what Laura said is right on target for me. Building that credibility early on so that when you hit the really difficult things, the board understands that you're giving them the best advice that you can give in the most effective communication you can give, and having them know there's nothing hidden, there's nothing else to worry about. I mean, that's really helpful. But I will say for me, growing that relationship was a long haul, not because it was hard in the sense that the individuals were difficult or anything. It's that I started at a pre-IPO company with venture-backed directors, and over time they got, replaced with more professional-oriented directors. And a public company director role is really high-stakes stuff. And we did have a couple of shareholder litigation issues that fortunately did not, turn out to be anything serious. But that's where, I would have one-on-one conversations with the lead independent director on some very serious things. And I would not, that's a totally different thing than a private company environment. The stakes are quite a bit different. And a lot of it is very almost personal oriented in the private company environment because they're more worried about how to get the money out,
Absolutely.
at some point. So that relationship really evolved. And the other thing I'll just throw out there to consider is that there are areas where you potentially get in a conflict where you're not necessarily a pure legal conflict, but just how do you advise people when the CEO is asking you questions about strategy and the directors are asking you questions about how the CEO is executing on the strategy? I mean, you get caught in the middle sometimes. You have to walk a very delicate line and ensure the board is fully informed sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Sharon, what about you in the board?
Yeah, I agree with everything. And I will say that IPO process and IPO readiness process and through the IPO does actually help you kind of train the board in working with you, and that you actually have a role and value. It's kind of a good time to kind of cement those relationships, because when you are public, there is more to do and more to worry about and more to talk about. But this gives you something, concrete to work with the board on. But I'll also say a quick story. When I got to GoPro, when I interviewed with that CFO that I told you passed away, he had told me I was going to be the corporate secretary and that I would be sitting in on board meetings. By the time the first meeting came, he had already passed, and the CEO told me I didn't need to go to the board meeting. And this is now my new boss, and I had to figure out how to manage this, but ultimately end up in where I had been promised and career-wise where I wanted to be. And he did tell me that it was one of the directors who didn't think highly of lawyers and highly of lawyers being in board meetings. And he thought that they just kind of stopped people from saying what they wanted to say. So I knew that I had to work with that director and figure out if I could change this around. And I took him to lunch and explained, the value that I add and other things that ultimately I think gave him comfort. And I did leave the lunch with him saying, okay, you're secretary, you can come to the meetings, but no other lawyer should be at the meetings, but you could be there, because they didn't even have their outside counsel attend the meetings when I had started. So they truly had no lawyers there. And he ended up being one of my biggest supporters, if not my biggest supporter on the board over the years. So that was a seminal.
It's a great story. Sharon, I'm going to stick with you for a second. You've done 2 IPOs, not just one. What were you able to learn from the first one that you brought to the second one?
Yeah, the first one, was pretty straight down the middle. It was a SaaS company. I had Wilson Sonsini as outside counsel. They taught me a lot. And I developed some tools that I used with execs and with the board and around communications and IPOs and all of that stuff, that when I got to GoPro and they started down this path, I could pull those out and shine those up, and I wasn't starting from scratch. But also GoPro did some things that we didn't do at Marketo, and it was a more complex IPO. And they had also at the time been looking at sale options, and they didn't, obviously go down that path, but there was a lot more going on. And I had to flex, and get out of my comfort zone for some of those things. But thankfully, I had that foundation from before. So, you know, having good tools, whether it's ones you've created or your outside counsel gives them to you, or your friends or Tech GC or wherever you're getting them, you know, having those, something that you could lean on, I think is really helpful. And, you know, and as I say, when things came down the line that were, you know, out of left field, I keep, why these having these baseball analogies, but in any event, I felt, you know, more ready to manage them because I had seen something similar enough before, or, you know, I wasn't working at a more basic level.
Right.
But also one of the things that I did at GoPro that I didn't do at Marketo, but I had sort of learned from my EA and Marketo experiences, was putting together a resource plan. What should the legal team look like over the next 12 to 18 months? Because I knew we were, you know, going through an IPO, and I knew that that would require more of the legal team. And then once you're public and you're more international, et cetera, you know, it's better to give people a vision of that early on than to just keep sort of asking at each budget cycle and trying to remind people of where you are. And so I put that together, and I used a lot of benchmarks from other similar type companies. And I think it was really helpful in establishing my credibility that I was a thoughtful leader. I wasn't just, you know, trying to kind of build an empire. I had reasons. I connected them to the business objectives, why, you know, we needed people in-house to be able to do that, what we were spending in outside counsel, et cetera. And that ended up being really helpful. And at 18 months, I was pretty much on target and what I said the legal team would look like, and that it did look like that at 18 months.
I think having that, relying on that data is key to building that credibility as well. I do want to focus a little bit on building a legal function, because we're close to the end of the hour. Can we switch to the next slide? So this slide is just an illustration of how a general counsel could potentially build the legal function as a company grows and matures. It's not meant to be an example for any one company. Gary and Sharon, I know you were the first attorney at your companies. How large was the company's business when you joined? Sharon, you said GoPro was almost $1 billion. I don't know how big Marketo was. Just sort of how did you build your departments up? Sharon, you use benchmarking data and others, but sort of how did you figure out where you needed to be first? And obviously it's going to be dependent on this type of company as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you need to understand where the company is and where it's going or trying to go, and, you know, think ahead, see farther, as I like to say. So, you know, start with what, I mean, your own, you know, obviously knowledge and previous experience, but, you know, what is the company doing and what kind of legal support does it need? And then should that support be in-house or should that be outside? Or maybe it's a combination of different things. I always say, and I'm sure you all probably agree, which is the core business is better in-house, and then things that you're not necessarily doing on a regular basis is where you sort of get special expertise outside contractors. But you know, GoPro's business, for just using GoPro as an example, changed over time too. And the IPO is actually a great time to really learn the business, even if you've been there for a while, you think you already know it, because the CEO and other leaders are having to express where the business is and where it's going, what the competitor, who the competitors are, and the landscape and the risks, et cetera. And you know, because that's all in the S1. And sometimes the CEO hasn't really thought of some of those things until he needs to. And you're getting a view in what where the CEO thinks the company is going to go, and what it really is, and how you're explaining it to the market. So I think that's really helpful in looking at your legal team and saying, is my legal team prepared to support the company where it is? Is it prepared to support the company and where it's going? And get ahead of that. Don't, you know, always be reactive in hiring people because you're totally slammed and you don't have enough of this or that. Like, think about that at a high level, but also even at a medium level. What are other functions doing that are going to affect the work that you have? And, you know, try to always keep your ears open for that, so you're not getting surprised.
That's why I always tried to get my team invited to various planning meetings that other functions had, just so they can learn what's going on, just as a fly on the wall, so we could help adapt to what they did. Gary, I know you were the first lawyer, and Laura, I want to make sure I understand. I talked to you because you inherited more of a department, but Gary, you were the first lawyer. And what was it like when you first got there? Like me, you came from, it was a software company, so, you know, probably more tech transactions and commercial attorneys, but how did it work for you?
For me, you know, I wish I did have enough forethought and prior experience as a full-scale GC to really build a resource plan like Sharon was talking about. I mean, that is really the key to it. So I focused in the beginning very tactically how to get the work done to keep the revenue in the door. But in hindsight, I think I would have built out a better plan. You never know for sure when the IPO is going to happen, but I think you can kind of plan as a bookend, where you want to be and keep updating your timeline. And I think in hindsight, the other thing I would do is I would also do a better job of building out my broad range of advisors. And there was a question on the chat about building out your skill areas and expertise. And I think my general answer there is you don't have to be an expert in everything. You just need to know people who are and how to get
whether
to
it's in-house or otherwise. As the company grows, you might have more in-house expertise, say for employment law. But having that team of advisors, whether it's outside counsel or in-house, lets you not either develop that expertise or just have it as part of your function.
Yeah, so by the time the IPO comes around, you really are focused on the things that allow your team to tactically execute not only the IPO, but the continued obligations going forward.
That makes sense. And Laura, what about you? You inherited an existing department when you came to SurveyMonkey.
I did, yeah. Eleanor, my predecessor, did a wonderful job of building a small team before I got there, and so that was great because there was a function, and there were a number of folks around who were quite talented. It was a pretty flat function, and so one of the things that I did when I came in, one of the things I wanted to do, and one of the things I did was build a little bit more of specific functional expertise within the legal department. I wanted people to be, I sort of saw it as steps, legs of a stool, and wanted to make sure we had each function within legal really well represented. So I spent a lot of time with the team finding out what they were doing, what they wanted to do. And if the two things matched, that was great. And if they didn't, trying to figure out how we could make it work. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. There were some areas that we needed more support on. Interestingly enough, SurveyMonkey was very much a self-serve tool at the time, and we were building the enterprise function. So we actually didn't have as strong a commercial function. We had a couple of commercial lawyers, but not a real leader. So I think one of the things you do is you have to spend a lot of time to figure out where you have the needs. So I spent my first 6 months a lot on the commercial, in the commercial space, working with the sales team that was just very nascent and being built to try to figure out what we needed. And then I said, we have some really great commercial lawyers, but I want a leader because I knew then we were going to move into the IPO process, and I was going to have to devote my time to privacy and things like that. And so I brought someone in to lead commercial after having spent, the first 6 or so months with the other members of the commercial team as we were trying to build out that enterprise function within the company. And so, I think you really, that's part of it, and part of building expertise. I totally agree with what you and Gary said. Finding one of the things that this was my first GC role. And one of the things that I think is most important is learning how to work with and learn from the people that know more than you about the things that you have to manage.
Absolutely.
And I was if I could just jump quickly on what Laura said, because I do think at some point, maybe earlier on, you want to start thinking about a strong number 2, because as you do go into the readiness process, can get consumed, and to have somebody who can kind of take up the slack for you is important. But frankly, once you're a public GC, a lot of your time is spent on executive matters and board matters, and having somebody who can help you on the day-to-day running of the department, I think is really important.
I wish I brought that person a little bit sooner, to your point.
And legal ops on that point too, just to throw that in, another critical, if you don't want to spend your time on it, if attorneys aren't always good at that.
So really quickly, this last topic, I'll do a quick lightning round so we have time for questions. How involved was your CEO, management generally, but your CEO in particular, in legal department issues and staffing? Did you get any input or feedback or pressure from management to make changes or to reduce resources or add resources? Laura?
Yeah, I would say I was given, I was very grateful for a lot of flexibility. My CEO actually happens to be a lawyer. He's never, right? He never practiced, but liked to point out to me that he had a law degree once in a while when he knew it would be annoying. But he and the rest of the management team, I think one of the beauties of having inherited a good legal department was that they knew we had good folks in place, and they brought me in for a particular reason. So I did have a fair amount of flexibility to spend time thinking about what I needed, and then I obviously had to justify what I needed, but didn't really have a lot of interference. More, and a lot of times I had a lot of support, and that was one of the things that I think was important, was working with the other senior management team to explain why I needed something or another, and because they got it, they would support it, and that was helpful.
Makes sense. Sharon, what about you?
Yeah, well, I told you about that resource plan.
Yes.
I actually kind of evolved that to every budget cycle, or if I started, as a new GC, I would put something similar together. I mean, it basically around what the objectives were of the company, and how our legal objectives aligned with it, and how our legal team was prepared or not. And if here's what we need in the budget to help prepare them. I told you about the story about the CEO and sort of not really understanding the legal role and having to kind of help educate. And I think, that is often the case in a company, not either Marketo or GoPro. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the legal team when I came in and how they were supporting the sales organization. And I had that was the first priority. I had to look at that, understand what was going on. They were all contract attorneys. And that was one of the issues, is they weren't, committed, and didn't really understand the business, and sort of how do we take that and make that better. And I did a survey in the beginning of what people's issues were, so I can show that to folks and have that to be reactive to. And then I did a survey 6 months later after making a lot of these changes. And of course, not surprisingly, it improved a lot. And I think that, and I was hoping that was going to happen, but I sort of understood it was going to happen if I did the right things. But that also was great for kind of legal marketing, if you will. Like, you told us this was a problem, look what we did, and here's what we're hearing. And, that's great.
Gary, any final thoughts on that? And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, just very quick, as someone who went through a PE buyout, I'll say the budget issues in hiring become extremely important in that scenario. And having a resource plan that's well thought out and showing a logical path is really critical, because there are pressures in those types of environments.
Makes sense. Thank you. We don't have any current questions in the chat. There was one that was fairly specific for one panelist, and we're going to answer that afterward. Are there any other questions that folks want to put in the Q&A before we start to wrap up?
I will just jump in as a general, because I think this is maybe an important, more general point, is for founder CEOs, there often is a perceived or real conflict between what's right for the company and what's right for that executive, but they often see themselves as the company, because that's they started the company in their garage or whatever. And I just think, I'm not going to answer like how you get through that now, but it is definitely something that takes thought and some sensitivity.
Absolutely. I came from a similar environment, and I agree with that 100%. And with that, I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank the participants, and I'll turn it back over to Bob Barker.
Great. Hey, thanks, Jennifer, for leading today's webinar. Lora, Gary, and Sharon, for sharing your insights on this important topic. Obviously, there's a lot of people that joined us today, and it's top of mind for them. So, and just in general, we want to make the GC Advantage program as valuable for you as possible. So your feedback is important. Everyone attending today will receive just a quick email or 1-minute survey that we conduct. Please complete that at your earliest convenience to provide some candid feedback. Always want to be better. And obviously, please contact us if you'd like to discuss any recruiting, coaching, or advising needs to help take your career to the next level. We look forward to having you join us at the next GC Advantage webinar soon here. Thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.